Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with The Secret of Shadow Ranch. Chapter 18, The Black Phantom. As the watchers stared amazed, a glowing speck stopped floating around and hung in the darkness. "Oh," Mrs. Thurman quavered, "they shine just like the ghost horse." Nancy switched on the rubber light. Before them stood Chief, a large rubber ball clutched in his jaws. Smiling at the flabbergasted onlookers, Nancy said, "Do you see how the phantom trick was worked?" "I do," George said promptly. "Phosphorescent paint on the dog's teeth." "Where are the specks now?" Mrs. Thurman asked as Chief dropped the ball. "They don't show when the lights are on. At the time Chief disappeared, after he chased the phantom horse, the spots were on his teeth," the young sleuth explained. "I thought perhaps he had bitten the ghost, but when I examined him in daylight, of course I found no evidence." "The gang must have washed him," remarked Best. "But they never thought of his teeth," Nancy said, "and fragments of the paint remained." "How did you get onto the idea?" Aunt Bet asked. Nancy reminded the others of her suspicion that Chief had been muzzled and taken away because the gang feared there was a clue to the apparition on him. "I learned in chemistry that phosphorescent paint glows in the dark after first it had been exposed to light," she went on. "I remember the time I had seen the phantom horse. There had been a light in the spring house just before. I put two and two together and decided that the apparition was a real horse. He was covered with a soft material which had been coated with phosphorescent paint and exposed to light in the spring house by one of the gang members." Mrs. Thurman drew a deep breath and turned to Nancy. "You're a downright marvel. That's what you are, young lady." Nancy blushed. "He'll stay now, won't you?" And the others all added to their pleas. "Of course I will," Mrs. Thurman declared. "You just show me the varmint that's been doing this no-good trick, and I'll give him a piece of my mind." Before going to bed, Nancy told Aunt Bet and Uncle Ed of her plan on the following day. The rancher assured her he would cooperate. At breakfast, the girls talked lightheartedly of their all-day horseback ride. "Where are you gals fixin' to go?" Shorty asked. "We'll start up Shadow Mountain," Nancy replied vaguely. "After that, we'll see." Mr. Raleigh broke in to appoint Tex and Bud as his helpers on the treasure expedition. When the meal was over, Nancy took Dave aside and told him that if she and the other girls found Valentine's hoard, they would light a fire on the Lookout Rock. "Good," he replied. "Then I'll drive down the valley in the truck and climb up the cliff houses by the front steps, helping me bring the treasure back to the ranch." Half an hour later, Uncle Ed, Tex, and Bud saddled up for their trip. Shorty hung around, eager to help as pack horses were let out. One was loaded with digging tools and the other with supplies. "What's the second animal for?" asked Sanders, who had been told the secret. The rancher owner grinned. "For the treasure." The trio headed down the valley away from Tumbleweed. Shorty watched them for a minute, then hurried into the woods behind the ranch house. Strolling toward the table, Nancy suspected that Bursey and Diamond were hiding among the trees, waiting to see which way the treasure party had gone. In the tack room, Dave helped Nancy pack small digging tools into a saddlebag and roll a spade in a blanket. The cowboy then saddled the girls' horses and slung the gear aboard two of them. Mrs. Thurman brought lunches, which Dave added to a pack as Nancy called to her companions that everything was ready. Before they mounted, Nancy suggested that they cross the big meadow. "We'll ride up Shadow Mountain from here, but it's in the opposite direction from the cliff dwellings," Alice whispered. "That's the idea," Nancy replied, "just in case Shorty suspects a trick and decides to follow us." Dave pulled out a stub and pencil and drew a map for Nancy on the back of an envelope. It showed a trail going east across the mountain to the cliff dwellings. 20 minutes later, the girls were heading up the Shadow Mountain. As they jogged along the trail, Nancy studied the map and noted that Dave's route began not far from the cabin. "We can go there first," she said. "If the gang is on a wild goose chase, now would be the good time to search their hiding place." Though the girls were eager to go on their real purpose, they spent the morning wandering over various trails. If anyone is following us, I hope he'll think we're just here for pleasure and give it a chase," Nancy remarked. In early afternoon, they stopped beside a stream to eat their lunch. They rode straight out for the cabin. After half an hour, however, they were brought up by huge boulders on the path. "A rockfall," George exclaimed. "We'll have to detour." The riders backtracked. They crossed a steep, stony slope, so treacherous that they were forced to dismount and lead their horses slowly. Finally, they reached Surge Clear Trail again. It was mid-afternoon when Alice cried out, "There's the cabin! I see the route!" The foursome rode up to the slope and ground hitched their horses. Cautiously, they made their way up toward the cabin. The door was open and no one was inside. Nancy led the way behind the cabin and noticed again how close the back window was to brush screen and rock wall. "What a funny place to put a window," Bess remarked. "Yeah, that's one of the reasons I feel there's a hiding place in the back of it somewhere," Nancy replied. "I think the window was used as an escape exit from the cabin." The girls examined the close-growing chaparral. A few feet to the side of the window, George discovered a break in the thorny bush. Nancy slipped into it, and one by one the girls struggled through and entered a narrow cleft in the rock. A few yards inside the opening, Nancy pointed out horseshoe paw and shoe prints. "Let's follow those prints," she suggested. "I have a hunch this path might lead to Valentine's hideout." The girls hurried to their mounts and soon were riding through the narrow paths with only a strip of blue sky visible above them. After a while, even that was blotted out by an overhang. The path grew gloomy and wound sharply around jagged outcrops. By the time the riders saw daylight again, the sun was low in the sky. They rode up a gentle slope and found themselves on a high plateau. Some distance ahead was a long, straight, rocky parapet about 12 feet high. Nancy reined up sharply. "Look!" she cried out. Built against the wall was a three-sided stone closure with an old wooden gate. Inside pranced a handsome black stallion. "The phantom horse!" Nancy exclaimed. As the four riders approached, the animal whinnied and reared, backing toward a crude lean-to stable. "Maybe the trick trappings are in here," George said. Nancy dismounted quickly, opened a wooden gate, and slipped in the enclosure. The black steed nickered nervously and shied away, but Nancy talked soothingly to him as she walked forward. There was a pile of hay in the corner of the stable. Nancy felt under it. In a few moments, her fingers encountered something soft, and she pulled out a bundle of white material. She carried it outside and closed the gate behind her. "The phantom costume!" Bess exclaimed as Nancy shook the filmy cloth. "It's Japanese silk, a very thin material used for theatrical effects," Nancy told the girls. She tucked the cloth into her saddlebag. "This table looks old," Bess remarked. "I don't think the king built it." "You're right," Alice exclaimed and pointed to a barely discernible heart scratched on the gate. "Then Valentine's hideout must be near here," Nancy said. As the girls looked around, Nancy noticed a huge rock jutting from the far end of the parapet. With a thrill of excitement, she recognized the lookout point. "We're on top of the cliff houses," she exclaimed. "Let's go to the wood ready for the fire, and then start searching for the treasure." Beyond the lookout rock, the girls could see a grove of trees. They rode over and tethered their horses. The wind moaned through the fir trees, and Nancy shivered. She took her sweater from the horn and threw it over her shoulders. It was nearly dusk, so the girls hung flashlights on their belts. Then they collected wood for the signal fire and carried it to the lookout rock just as the sun set. Nancy was the last to make her way off the rock. To one side, it was a short flight of worn steps going top row of cliff apartments. Nancy was about to lead the descent when they heard the howl of a coyote. She stopped short. "What's the matter?" asked Alice. Shh, listen. Everyone froze. "I hope that's a real coyote." Bess gasped. "You mean Shorty?" "If the gang has discovered our ruse, they may have backtracked and traced us here," George said. Nancy nodded. "We better not turn our lights on." Hugging the parapet, the girls went down to the steps to the narrow walk which ran through the front of the apartments. To their left was a sheer drop-off. For a moment they stood still, breathless at the height and sight. Suddenly there came a thump from the first room. Bess grabbed George's arm and Nancy and Alice gasped. Quietly, Nancy stepped to the open doorway and peered into the gloom. A man was lying on the floor. And that's the end of that chapter.